is an urban planner, landscape architect, and the founder and dean of the College of Architecture and Landscape Architecture at Peking University. And he'll present on approaches to protect the land from the effects of rapid urbanization while building a network of green infrastructure to safeguard natural processes. Our second speaker will be Dr. Lena Chan. She's the Senior Director from Singapore's National Parks Board, and she will share Singapore's work on incorporating nature and urban biodiversity and transitioning to city nature. Our third speaker will be Shuman Wang, our Senior Urban Specialist at the World Bank, and she will present on concretizing how the ideas of Professor Yu and Dr. Chan can be operationalized within the context of our World Bank project. And then our two discussants will be from the World Bank, Karen Kemper, Global Director for Environment, Natural Resources and the Blue Economy Global Practice, with whom we're co-conspiring to have this perspective on urban and environmental issues, and Professor Gretchen Daly, professor at Stanford Center for Conservation Biology at Stanford University. And a special thank you to Dr. Lena Chan, who's joining us late at night, and to Professor Gretchen Daly, who's joining us really early in the morning from California. And with that, let me turn it to Jürgen. Jürgen, thank you.
Well, thank you so much, and hello and welcome everybody to this second seminar in the series. I'm really delighted that I'm able to join you once again for this event hosted by the Global Platform for Sustainable Cities. Today's session, we will focus on bringing nature to cities, and this is especially timely because if anything, COVID-19 has highlighted the tremendous negative impacts of neglecting nature and biodiversity. We are, as we speak, destroying the ecosystem supporting human life, and in doing so, we are undermining our well-being and our planet. We are facing the sixth mass extinction. Many of you will be following this. Nearly 1 million animal and plant species are now threatened with extinction, and many will disappear in the decades to come. This is not a sustainable solution and a situation, and cities need to be a part of the solution. Of course, land use change is one of the major causes threatening biodiversity loss and ecosystems destruction. And such change is driven, among other factors, of course, agriculture and expansion is very big, but so is massive urban land expansion due to rapid urbanization, which is resulting in urban sprawl. An additional 2.5 billion people will be moving to cities between now and 2050. Just to give you a sense, this is the equivalent of the entire population of Turkey moving to cities each year between now and 2050. Between 2000 and 2030, land expansion due to urbanization is projected to triple at the same time that urban population growth is expected to double. In Africa, this trend is especially concerning. Urban land expansion is expected to increase 7-fold at the same time that urban population growth is expected to grow by 160%. You will all know that the Africa region is the fastest urbanization, has the fastest urbanization rate on Earth. And it's not just the land conversion, but also water consumption, waste generation, among many of the trends that are detrimental to the environment and to our planet. In fact, more than 500 major cities around the globe are actually located in what are called biodiversity hotspots. How cities choose to accommodate urban population growth and manage their limited land, water, and other resources while reducing waste and pollution and protecting biodiversity will have significant impacts, not only on the environment, but also on economic development, on security, and on the health aspects. I've actually worked in China for over 30 years on and off, starting in the mid-1980s. And of course, we all know urbanization has been one of the major drivers of growth. China's urbanization rate grew from less than 20% in 1978 to about 60% now. And by 2030, more than 1 billion people will live in cities in China. And I've kind of personally witnessed over the last 3.5 decades, how this rapid and massive structural transformation of the economy really vastly improved living standards and how it changed fundamentally the way Chinese people live. Yet at the same time, I've also seen the negative consequences of such unfettered urbanization, if you like, including tremendous environmental degradation, unsustainable consumption of natural resources, and the aggressive role to urban land conversion. If those trends continue, cities' demand for resources will exceed the regenerative capacity in their ecosystems. And we certainly have seen signs of it. Of course, in China, just like in many other countries, there are extremely good examples of how to do this differently. And we will hear today from one of the leading thinkers in the country, what can be done if it's done right. So of course, the good news is, as I said, that those trends can be reversed. You can do better land use planning, you can invest in nature, and you can really work on the policy front and on the regulatory action and incentive front. I actually see 3 transitions that are required if you really want to implement a holistic and systemic solution. So first, we need to change the way we plan. Most of the city sprawl and city development around the world, as we discussed also during the first session, is not well planned. So by shifting away from urban planning practices that prioritize engineering solutions to urban infrastructure towards an ecological approach that emphasizes restoring, protecting, and strengthening nature, we can make this an integral part of city spatial planning strategies and urban land use planning. And as I said, you will hear a number of excellent examples how to do this in some of the leading cities around the world. Second, we need to focus on connectivity of these natural assets. Let's not just think site-specific intervention here and a park there and a canal cleanup there, but to basically interconnect the network of green and blue assets that enhance the integration of ecosystem services, ecological flows, and the richness of biodiversity in an urban and city environment. And third, we need to introduce nature-based solutions much more deliberately, much more broadly to the built environment and undertake ecological restoration and shift away from an emphasis on traditional gray urban infrastructure. Nature-based solutions incorporates ecosystem services into infrastructure to contribute to human flourishing and advance biodiversity benefits, while at the same time it can be really cost effective and above all also reduce the carbon footprint in the cities. Now, these may be daunting challenges, but they're great opportunities for win-win solutions. We all know cities can do better. We know they can do better. So bringing nature to cities will not only help conserve the environment and generate tremendous health benefits, but it will also deliver a greener growth path and chart a path for the green recovery, including a significant contribution to our climate change challenge. So I'm now delighted again to, Sami has already introduced our speakers for this session. Delighted to welcome the 3 external speakers also on my behalf, and one Professor Yu, who is an absolute leading authority in China on the topic, Dr. Lena Chang from Singapore National Parks Board, and Professor Gretchen Daly from Stanford University. We will also then later, as Sami has pointed out, from our colleague Xueman and from Karen Kemper, who's the director for our environment department here, on their perspectives on the topic. So thank you, and I look forward to a fruitful conversation. Back to you, Sami.
Thank you very much, Jürgen. And I think without further ado, I'll pass it to Professor Yu. So Professor Yu, a pleasure to welcome you.
Sorry.
Yes.
Oh, can you see it?
Yes, perfect.
Hello?
Yes. Go ahead, Professor Yu.
Exactly what Jürgen just said. China has facing a serious problem of urban sprawl, and now the issue is how to bring back nature into the city. So my topic is ecological infrastructure and nature-based solutions. Because of this urban sprawl and too much industrialization in the past 4 decades, we are facing a whole series of challenges. Climate change, of course, but including climate change, we have others: flood, drought, pollution, habitat loss. And today we have this COVID-19, of course, it's part of this whole system degradation. But climate change and the issues is not new actually in China. When you look at the monsoon climate in China, it's happened every year. So a dramatic change of climate change. And to adapt this kind of environmental situation, or ecological situation, we have a rich, very rich cultural heritage, cultural wisdom in adapting to all these issues. But such wisdom actually forgotten or been buried under layers of so-called modern modernism or modern industrial technologies. So we use so much concrete, we call it gray infrastructure, try to solve the problem of flood, drought, pollution, building all these pipe system, and depend on sewage system to try to clean up the water. But yet, this single goal mandated gray infrastructure built upon industrial technology simply lack resiliency, and in many cases, not sustainable. So the alternative is we call nature-based solutions. It's time to revive the ancient wisdom, to develop the nature-based wisdom, and to solve the problem holistically. We call it ecological infrastructure that are critical for securing ecosystem services, including provision, regulation, life-supporting, spiritual and cultural services. So it is a holistic solution. It's a holistic way to solve the problem, not just single-minded, a one-goal shot. As Jorgen just mentioned, 2 levels to me here for this lecture, I think is important. So first is certainly planning. How can we create an ecological infrastructure across scale? Now it's a planning strategy where we define the line that should secure the nature to function as a critical ecological infrastructure. The second is certainly is about design and engineering, to bring in the nature-based techniques to create this kind of ecological infrastructure. So planning across the scales. Again, you can see it is an infrastructure, but it is certainly a green infrastructure. This just show you how can we do that, to following the water courses, to dechannelize to turn the gray into green infrastructure, and that must be across the scale. It is a system. It is a connected, as Jorgen just mentioned, it should be connected and connected to the infrastructure. And certainly, we have to depend on the scientific solutions, scientific analysis based on the modeling of the ecological process, and identify where the natural system can be built, where to define the critical natural system. And from national scale, also way to the regional and to the community levels. Now, this was what we have done in the past 20 years to create a national ecological infrastructure, and certainly at other levels. And at the second level is about design and engineering. A method here I want to introduce is to get inspirations from the ancient wisdom, the ancient knowledge about field making, irrigation, and fertilizing, and to turn this ancient wisdom, to upgrade this wisdom into modern engineering solution, become standardized and testable and operationable across the scale. The modern turn into modern engineering solution. And for the past 20 years, we have tested these solutions and built over 500 projects in over 200 cities all over China and in some parts of other parts of the world. I want to just show you some examples how this green infrastructure can replace the gray infrastructure, to turn gray into green. One biggest problem is about flood. We spend billions of dollars every year trying to protect the city from being flooded. But the problem is that when we channelize in the damming the rivers, we destroy the whole natural system, and there's no resiliency. You can see here. But actually, when you look at flood, didn't take so much of the land. We calculate only 1% of national land is needed to to hold water on the ground. So give land back to nature. It's not a luxury strategy. So then we come to the real project. Back 17 years ago, this is our first project in China, in South China's Zhejiang province. We actually moved the concrete and turned the flood wall into back to the nature. Terrace it, create pond dike system around the bank and turn the river bank into a soft, spongy river system. So nature come back, frogs come back, and the river become more safe, more resilient, and with increase in biodiversity, of course. Now, this is another section of the river because the city got satisfied with our first project, and they continue to use this strategy to dechannelize the whole river and turn the concrete black-gray infrastructure into green. Now, we didn't take we just use the same space, actually, just different strategies. Instead of build the high walls along the river, we actually can remove the high wall and turn the riverbank into a soft, sponge system to retain the water, to clean the water, and to create habitat for biodiversity. But at the same time, allow people to have a recreational opportunity. Another example is also here in Jinhua, in Zhejiang province, a huge flood wall made of concrete, and we terracing it and turn it is a ecological friendly flood wall, terraced. So that's a dramatic change, and we can reduce flood peak by 40 to 60% just by transforming the gray into green. That's been tested. You can see 100-year flood. So the whole green zone can be flooded during the monsoon season. And 2 weeks later, you can see this green space become a public park. People can use it all year round. So it's a sharing between nature and the social use, and as resilient as the city become more resilient. So you can see how much can be changed if nature-based solution is to be implemented nationwide and certainly global-wise. All China today, in all of China, I mean, most of the rivers been channelized like that, and it's continuing to be channelized like that. So I think it's immediate action should be taken to stop and to transform this kind of system, because the river system is critical natural habitat. If you want to bring nature back to the city, you have to transform gray into green. And the second kind of case is create a sponge city in the metropolitan area to create a water resilient cities. Over 60% of Chinese cities are suffering monsoon climate, flood every year, and drought, of course, at the same time. And at the same time, we drain away all the water. So the alternative is to create a sponge system in the metropolitan area to allow water to retain, to be retained and to be drained naturally, slowly, and recharges the aquifer. That's create an urban, regional scale green infrastructure across a scale. Then we tested this strategy at the critical spot. You can see here there's two critical spot, which we want just demonstrate how this can work. So this is about a 1 square kilometer in size, right in the middle of the city, and it is a flooded area, heavy urban inundation every year. People suffered, and the property value devaluated. So we are inspired by the Chinese Pearl River Delta's pond and dike system to transform the swamp into a habitable, productive, beautiful landscape. So we create this kind of sponge right in the middle of the city, and islanding, terracing, ponding to create a habitat of biodiversity, and also at the same time be used for as a public space while solving the problem of urban inundation. That is the rendering, and that's 1 year, just 1 year after. And very simple, replicable technology at large scale. It was before, and this was after. And this was today, just after 3 years. And we have also tested this kind of performance. You can see this was before urban inundation during the monsoon season, and this is after the dramatic change. And another case, another spot is at the coastal area in Sanya. Also, the city was suffering climate change, heavy storm during the monsoon season, and people built this wall to try to protect the city from being flooded. Strong concrete, but there's no resiliency here. So we introduced this kind of nature-based solution to introduce back to restore the mangrove in the city. That was the site. You can see how the flood wall was built just under construction. So we stopped the process, and instead we actually restore the mangrove and remove the flood wall and let the water go into the green space, go into the city, and where the salt water and the fresh water meet and create habitat for mangrove. So it takes just 2 years. You can see it come back, lush vegetation. One side is for people to use for habitat. The other side, I mean, one side is for public space. The other side will be for native species, for birds, habitat for birds. Now that was the site before. It is a dump of urban construction debris within the flood wall. Now this was today, and that's recovered native habitat right in the middle of the city. And at the same time, you can see the land property, the property value increased dramatically, and also create a beautiful habitat at the same time. Water cleansing is another problem. The sewage, 85% of sewage global-wise was untreated and dumped into the ocean. In China, 75% of surface water is polluted. How can we cleanse such kind of massive water pollution? Certainly, we cannot depend on great infrastructure because it's too expensive for the developing countries. So we have tested these green solutions. This is Shanghai 10 years ago. We built this biological process, use terracing wetland to filtrate contaminated water, to turn the contaminated water into clean water. And certainly the process, this aeration process is, and this is a wetland system. You can see vegetation grow. That was a site before. As a process of terracing the ground to create a wetland filtration system. This is covered by native species, native grass, native wetland species. And after 1 mile, the water run out, crystal clean, from very dirty 5th grade water into a 2nd or 3rd grade clean water, which is swimmable. And this is a performance test. 85% of nitrogen and phosphorus can be removed by this kind of process. At the same time, as again, it's a holistic solution. At the same time, you will create habitat for biodiversity and also create a recreational space, public space for the people to use. And we replicate this kind of solution at an even larger scale. These are about 17 kilometer long river in Haikou, Hainan Island, polluted, channelized, dumped with all this garbage, and it was flooded during the monsoon season. All kinds of problems. For 20 years, people try to solve the problem by the gray concrete. Build a concrete wall and drainage and dredge the dirty water, but it never solves the problem. So we use a green solution, remove the concrete actually, totally remove the concrete and recover the natural system, terracing the ground and turn the riverbank into a filtration system. As a process, you can see it. The whole project only take 1 year actually, and that's under construction. That's built, and this is a whole section description you can see before and after, and introduce the mangrove into the city, and it recycles the concrete, and certainly as habitat recovered, fish come back, and we tested and see 85% of nitrogen, phosphorus can be removed. As we're looking forward, how can we clean the water? This is a very inexpensive solution, can be practiced at a massive scale. We are looking for Taihu, for example, more than 2,000 square kilometer size in terms of and heavily polluted. And this is our rendering to show how can we clean the whole lake by transforming the agricultural practice, integrating the agricultural practice with the cleansing system, and also look what was happening in the sea, the ocean, the Bohai Sea, which is huge, 700,000 square kilometers in size. It's virtually dead sea. And how can we solve this problem? So it is a designed ecological system again to filtrate the nitrogen, phosphorus, remove the concrete, it turns gray into green. And this is a pilot project. It's a pilot project, of course, certainly, and also introducing habitat at the same time. And soil remediation also, as our testing experimental project in Tianjin, heavily contaminated urban brownfield and outline, collect stormwater and use the stormwater to initiate the natural process and let native habitat to be recovered, at the same time solve the problem of urban stormwater and transform the brownfield into greenfield and introducing native habitat. At the same time, create a public space for people to use. Again, we have tested and see how the soil can be transformed, be remediated, and biodiversity come back dramatically improved. I will quote, in terms of biological biodiversity, I will quote Wilson's comment. In the expanding enterprise, landscape design, which means bring nature back to the city, will play a decisive role. So to conclude, we are at a new era of civilization. More than ever, it is clear that we need a paradigm shift in planning and designing our city to adapt the changing climate and solving the multiple urban ecological issues. Such a shift calls for a rethinking of the way we build our cities based on industrial technologies, and calls for the revival of the ancient wisdom of survival, the nature-based solutions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Yu, for this excellent presentation. And maybe if we can shift to Dr. Chan.
Yeah.
For her presentation on Singapore. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to share screen. I'm going to try this. I'm looking for nature-based solution, but unfortunately, I've got to rely on technology here. So bear with me for a while. Okay.
If not, we can share it from our end.
Yes, please, please. Is that Rani? I think
Yes.
that'd be great. That'd be great. Thank you very much, Rani. Thank you. Yeah. Whether it's what Yochanan said at the global level, or what Prof. You had said at the country level of China, which is huge, and similarly in Singapore, we face many challenges today: biodiversity loss, climate change, rapid development, and the latest edition that fell on our lap, that's descended upon us, COVID-19. But scientific research has shown increasingly that biodiversity is critical for not only human health, but our survival. How do we resolve this conundrum? The decision for the Global Platform for Sustainable Cities to select the theme, Bringing Nature to Cities, for its online series is most timely and apt. I would like to share with you Singapore's approach and resolution to this problem using nature-based solutions. Now, how do I move to the next slide? Oh, okay, thank you. Yeah. So Singapore, I would like to put it in a context that we are a city, and at the same time, we're a state, which means that we have many more responsibilities than that of a city. We have to think of land use allocated for defense and water and for infrastructure of various kinds. And more so, we are constrained that we're an island. So an island with limited land resources that would have to meet the multiple demands. So we really stretch. And our land area is only 722 square kilometers, which is really very, very tiny compared to China and the rest of the world. But we have a population of 5.6 million. So we've got to then deal with high population density, but how do we cope? How do we coexist with rich biodiversity? So we need to do this very critical balancing act. That's just to show you some of the biodiversity we find in Singapore. Next, please. So just to give you again in context, these numbers might seem low compared to the world, but 414 bird species in a small little city state like Singapore represents almost 4% of the world's bird population. And what that might surprise you, that the 255 hard coral species compared to 800 hard coral species in the world, that forms about 30% that we harbor 30. So while we like to say we've got great biodiversity, rich biodiversity, we have a very, very heavy responsibility over our shoulders to actually try and conserve them. Next, please. So we used to be a garden city that we transformed to a city in a garden. And it was like 50 years of greening. We intensified tree planting, we strengthened connectivity of parks and greenery with park connectors, and integrated greenery with built environment. But in the light of today's challenges, we have to do more. We can't look at things on a piecemeal basis. It's got to be a holistic, integrated approach. And our solution is to restore nature back into the city for livability, sustainability, and well-being. So we have evolved this concept, a new paradigm, and that is city in nature, which is a truly unique value proposition where we're doing it for people and nature together. So we have integrated ecology into the urban landscape, ensure that we create sustainable ecosystems for both nature and people to thrive. If we don't do it for both, it's difficult to engage everybody. And we want to provide immersive experiences, not stand by onlookers, but immersive experiences with nature for improved health well-being. And we have to build up stewardship in our communities. Next, please. Next, please. So in our framework, in applying nature-based solutions, we're looking for outcomes of sustainable economic growth. Let's not kid ourselves. We need economic growth, but how do we do it with biodiversity conservation? You want high livability, that's important. But at the same time, these three resilience are extremely critical. Ecological resilience, climate resilience, and social resilience. So how do we do it? Like what Prof. Yu said, we need to actually layer the different aspects: social layer, ecological layer, recreational layer, greenery layer that we've built on from our core base area of green cover that we have been doing for the past 50 over years, when we evolved from garden city to a city in a garden, and now to a new paradigm of city in nature. Next, please. This shows you, in order for us to make it sustainable, we've got to safeguard and strengthen our core areas. We have over 10 or more ecosystems. We need to conserve, safeguard our forests, tropical rainforest. This is in Bukit Timah Nature Reserve. And come and visit us when COVID-19 has settled and see the tropical rainforest that we can find in a city. Next, please. Next, can I? Yeah. So we also have, can we just go back one? Back, please. Okay, so here we have mangroves. We have Sungai Buloh with mangroves and intertidal mudflats. This is extremely important in the context of a global context, because migratory birds fly through it to winter, and at the same time when they come back after wintering in the southern hemisphere. Now, if you can see just above towards the top, those are aquaculture projects. So that is where you can have a nature reserve, but at the same time, you can also have aquaculture, which means that you can have agriculture going on or fisheries going on, at the same time have your nature reserve. Next, please. We also have these tiny islands, but it's so rich in marine biodiversity. The little island on top is the Little Sisters. And Little Sisters, we have a research lab there. At the same time, we have actually built up a turtle sanctuary. And we couldn't believe it that turtles are actually coming to our coastline and laying eggs. And so to safeguard them, what we do is we've also based on extremely important science-based, and use science to actually learn how to transfer these turtle eggs at the optimum time and then put them in Sisters Island so that they can actually hatch safely. And we've got to make sure that they are being deposited at the right depth, because different depth will actually result in different sexes of the turtles. Next, please. So you just see that right smack in the city, you have wildlife like birds building nests in high-rise buildings. Next, please. You have migratory birds flying through. Next, please. And it's important that we actually document whether our corals are actually propagating. So this is actually coral spawning. And it's so exciting to see them spawn because it shows that they are alive and they're propagating, and we're going to have new baby corals. Many Singaporeans are trying to learn from our corals too, because we are trying to, breed more Singaporeans. So next, please. These are the turtles actually happily having hatched the hatchlings, moving to the ocean. Next, please. So the next important thing is ecological connections. And years ago, in the name of development, we had a highway dissecting the nature reserve, the Central Nature Reserve. So we now have Bukit Timah separated from the central catchment. But this is where we worked with different agencies, the Land Transport Authority, and said, we need to actually reconnect this. So what we've done is actually build a connection that would link Bukit Timah Nature Reserve to the central catchment. And you can see right on top of an 8-lane highway is an ecological link, and it's called EcoLink at BTNR, which is Bukit Timah, BKE, which is Bukit Timah Expressway. Now, just a few years ago, this was just bare, and now you can't differentiate between, the rich vegetation, and that's because we're lucky enough to be in the tropics, and you can push any stick on the ground and it grows. Next, please. Next, please. So we do ecological connections right through. So this is actually a road, and if you notice that the overarching canopy acts as a kind of a bridge for primates and squirrels and birds to fly across, the shy birds. And the other thing that we have now used as nature-based solution is, instead of having just nicely planted trees, big trees, we have actually emulated that of a primary rainforest in the structures. So if you notice that there are actually different layers of trees and different kinds of native trees that are planted in between these tall trees. And that's important because you're providing multi-altitudinal niches for fauna. And the other thing is, it's also increasing biodiversity. And we are also doing another important thing, successional planning. Because when these big trees die, then you have all these younger trees coming up. And it's also very important because it actually reduces heat, and it protects the soil. So it's multifunctional. So even a infrastructure like roadside planting can be green. Next, please. So that shows you in a graphic manner how these tree planting, the way we plant our roadsides and dividers, can form ecological connections. Next, please. In buildings, in any city, there are bound to be lots and lots of concrete buildings. Now, this is actually a retirement home, but it's just, you know, completely filled with greenery everywhere. So it's not only ecological resilience, right on top, at the top layer, there's actually a community garden where people can actually grow plants and use horticulture as a kind of therapy, and they can actually reap the fruits and vegetables from there. So there's urban agriculture, but more important, there's also social resilience, because people can exercise, and you can see exercise equipment, and there are little nooks and corners where people can actually sit down, and it's multi-generational, because even though it's for retirement, but we are trying to encourage the older generation to look after the young, so that the mid-generation will be able to work. So you have interaction between grandparents looking after the grandchildren. Next, please. Hotel. This is Park Royal at Pickering, and you can see how even our structure, like hotels, have recognize the importance of greenery. Next, please. This is a learning forest in the Singapore Botanic Gardens, which is only about 10 minutes away or 15 minutes away from Orchard Road, which is one of the busiest shopping areas in Singapore. And you notice that what we have done here is restored a wetlands. And as Prof. Yu said, when you restore wetlands, it has multi-purpose. Number one, it helps to control flood during drought situation. It actually alleviate drought conditions. It's recreation, is great for recreation as well as for education. And you can see not only various kinds of birds, but also lots of otters coming in. Next, please. So this is Ang Mo Kio, Bishan Ang Mo Kio Park, and right down you can see a drain, and now it's naturalized. Next, please. Next, please. Yeah. So this is Jurong Lake Gardens, and similarly we have restored a freshwater swarm and make sure that people can actually appreciate it. Next, please. Next, please. Yeah. So it's important to involve the community, and which is why community stewardship is an extremely important aspect of making sure that the city in nature succeeds. So we reach out to families, citizens, scientists, schools, and everybody. Next, please. And this is actually in a school, a wetlands in a school where the kids actually study not just biology, but languages. Next, please. Next, please. Next, please. Yeah. So you have community actually playing a role by planting trees. So the community gets involved. Next. Next, please. Next. Yeah. Kids play in a biophilic garden. Next. Next, please. So doing all that, we need to measure whether what we are doing is giving us the results we want. So we have developed an index called the Singapore Index of Cities Biodiversity. And it's a self-monitoring tool for cities, and it's developed in collaboration with the Secretary of the CBD and a global partnership in local and subnational. So the updated version will be published soon, and we hope that more people will actually join in and apply this. More cities will try and apply it. Next, please. So in conclusion, biodiversity must be mainstreamed into all sectors. Hence, everyone must and can play a part in ensuring that the evolution of Singapore into a city in nature becomes a successful reality. If Singapore can do it, cities around the world should also be able to become cities in nature. So we hope that the global platform of sustainable cities would join in this effort to make their city, a biophilic city in nature. We all must go on this journey together. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chan. And these were two great presentations in tandem, hearing about nature-based solutions at this excellent scale in many of the cities in China, and then moving to an application on a citywide approach in Singapore. And with that, Schumann, Wang, on some of the applications within the World Bank. Schumann, over to you, please.
Hello? You can hear me now, right?
We can hear you, but we see end of slideshow, click to exit.
Okay, so let me just, today seems that we have a lot of problem with technology. So let me just use this screen. I don't know, I just say that how, so I want to use this a few minutes to share with you that how we translate some of the ideas and approach you just heard from Professor Yu and also Dr. Nena into project activity. This is a project under the World Bank project under preparation financed by the Global Environment Facility. And to begin with, let me also quickly also repeat what Jürgen has said about the challenges facing Chinese cities. You have heard that within the next 10 years, actually 200 million people were moved to a city. We're talking about 1 billion people in China. So how the Chinese city is managing urban sustainability really matters to China and also matters to the rest of the world. So one thing good news is that most Chinese cities are making transition, how to pursue high-speed GDP growth to high-quality growth. And the central part of this high-quality growth is to pursue ecological conservation, green growth. But as we have seen that this green, in this green undertaking, so what we have seen that a number of challenges facing the cities. First, as Professor Yu mentioned, the priority is still give the green infrastructure. Even they do the green spaces, largely also use engineering solutions. And last thing, we also have found that, yes, cities have increased their green spaces, but on the other hand, those green spaces, those interventions tend to really for beautification purpose. And also it's been done in a way kind of ad hoc, not in a coherent, connected approach. So that's your way that, because if you want to make the biodiversity thrive, the eco-connectivity, as Dr. Lena Chen mentioned, is absolutely critical. So another challenge facing those cities, whilst your municipal governments put a lot of resources behind to finance green spaces, water, natural assets, but then the challenge is that how to make it sustainable financially, because it's upfront investment and also subsequent maintenance also it's a high cost. So what will be the modality, how to involve private sector, where we find revenue stream. So those are a number of challenges we have identified. As a result, we are working with 3 cities and also a city cluster. Even everything in China is big, even we talk about just 3 cities, 1 cluster, a city cluster, we are talking about more than 100 million people and the size of 1 city, Chongqing. And if you look at the territory, so we are talking about almost size as a country of Austria. So what we are doing will have a large impact on the way of thinking and new way of doing planning. So let me also very quickly go through that how we translate those ideas into specific project activities. So the first part is on ecological planning. And here what we'll do is that to provide a GIS tool to help cities to map out natural assets, blue assets, green assets that includes water, wetlands, green spaces, parks and trees and green roofings, and to understand and where the connectivity would be, where the area that ecological restorations need to be undertaken, and also how the urban planners would better use land planning. use land. So that's the first part. And the second part is about the biodiversity strategy. And here, actually, urban biodiversity is still a new concept for many Chinese cities. They very much embrace it. But at the central part of biodiversity strategy is connectivity. Biodiversity would strive through connectivity rather than fragmented your isolations or your interventions. So based on the analysis on the ecological system and services that will help cities build up an inventory and understand where the inventory, and then from there that how to enhance biodiversity. And the cities will use Singapore Index as an important tool to monitor biodiversity, to manage biodiversity. So that's the second component. And the third component is we call it how to build a foundation to help cities invest in nature. And here we look at the three elements. And first is that the natural capital accounting. We have heard put a price to carbon, and it's important to also put a price to those natural assets. We use the modeling tools to evaluate economic evaluation of those natural assets. So cities to understand those green spaces have a price and has a price tag. So that's the first part. And second part is also the cities have identified number of sites. And here that we would introduce nature-based solutions, how to help cities design, use the nature-based solutions to the intervention rather than engineering approach. So that's the second part. And third part, working with the number of private sector, really to understand what would be the financial modality and where the revenue stream, where they would come from, your fees or come from the land value capture. So what would be long-term urban sustainability to finance all those investments? So those are three components we are working with cities and to bring that the green ecological systematic planning to the city's overall way of doing strategy, a way of planning. We are very pleased to say that many cities are very encouraged by this kind of new approach, and we have got very high attention and support from the leadership. So moving forward, we would like to work not only with the Chinese city as also cities around the world to bring that new way of thinking into urban planning. So that's all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Schumann. And I think with that, if we can pass it to our first discussant, Karen Kemper, Global Director for Environment. Karen.
Thank you, Sami, and good morning and good afternoon and good evening, everyone. I'm really very pleased to participate in this webinar on bringing nature to cities. The topic is super important, as we just heard, and it's very central to the time that we are living in. And in fact, at no time before maybe has it become so clear and evident to us how systemic is the nature of biodiversity and ecosystem services and how these risks are. So I would like to thank Dr. Chan and Professor Yu for their very insightful and inspiring presentations. And as we heard from all three speakers, nature underpins every aspect and all forms of life and socioeconomic activities. However, the altering land use and human transformed environments have fragmented and encroached into natural habitats, disturbing ecosystems. And we know that more than 1 million species are now threatened with extinction. And Jürgen talked about that in the beginning when he talked about the third mass extinction that is going on. And that, of course, is in part due to the rapid conversion of natural habitats and the urban encroachment on ecosystems. So with the ongoing pandemic and the COVID-19 pandemic in particular, but even the previous ones that we had and that were contained a bit more quickly, but with the ongoing one, we have a much broader public, I think, has learned that pathogens thrive where there are changes in the environment. And when natural ecosystems are under stress from human activity. And we saw the figures that Schumann showed about the growth of cities and the overall conversion of rural population to urban population. So there's a lot of conversion of ecosystems that are coming together with urban populations. And there's approximately 500 large cities that are considered to be located in biodiversity hotspots. That is quite an amazing number. So with these grim challenges in a way that we have, the presentations and insights shared by Professor Yu and Dr. Chen are timely and more relevant than ever. Professor Yu shared the integrated ecological approach and how it can create healthy places. I think my main takeaway that will always stay with me is the sponge approach. Many of us come from water resources and landscapes approaches, and one still thinks a bit of the hard approaches, but I think a sponge approach really speaks to anyone, even if one hasn't really thought too intensely about the biodiversity or ecological aspects of what one could do. I think it was particularly interesting to hear also how the riverbanks can be turned into filtration systems, and how the sponge approach again can be extremely useful for soil remediation. And it's not only China that deals with that issue, but the contaminated soil issue is something we find from Kosovo, where the bank is supporting, to India and to the United States. It's everywhere, and it's an important issue. Now, we also heard from Dr. Chan how Singapore is moving towards the city in nature approach and initiative. And that, I think, can be a little bit of guidance of where we look at. Perhaps one could think about something like mega corridors, because usually one thinks about, when one hears about conservation and biodiversity, as a lot of thinking about those areas that are still natural. But what if, through a city in nature approach, one really creates mega corridors where the cities are part of the corridors, as opposed to thinking of corridors that happen where there are no cities. And I think this is something that perhaps is a takeaway to think about more clearly. Now, in the case of Singapore, it's an island, it is different, but if we look at cities that are on broader land masses, one could do that. Now, a few words on how the World Bank looks at biodiversity. We think it's a really important part of the development agenda. Our data show that renewable capital, forests, land protected areas account for about 43% of total wealth in low income countries, and for about 20% of total wealth in lower middle income countries. So it's really important to have nature and functioning ecosystems for these countries and all of the fruits that come from these functioning systems. We have ongoing research that is going to come out in a month or two from now, and that shows how we can think about tipping points. So you all have heard about the pollinator tipping points, about forest tipping points. So we have taken some of those, and they show that if we really get to these tipping points, then we can see look at a loss of 10% of GDP growth globally. And in some developing countries, up to 20–25% of GDP growth loss. So I'm not talking about lowering the GDP by 25%, but the growth. Now, if you're a poor country that wants to develop, that's a lot. You don't really want to lose that. And again, functioning biodiversity and ecosystems really are key for countries. So in the World Bank, we have been engaging and investing in biodiversity for decades in various ways. Both on the forest side, on the ocean side, and on land. But you also heard from Schumann how we are engaging at the city level and how we can bring that together. We are very committed to supporting at least 15 countries in our current IDA cycle, that is the cycle for the poorest countries in the world, to help them support, build, renew and update their national biodiversity plans. Of course, that could and should include urban biodiversity in the sense that we are talking about today. Now, a few words on the private sector. It has a really important role to play. There's the international data from the Paulson Institute shows that there's a funding gap of about $700 billion a year on biodiversity that would not come from the public sector alone. There is just not enough funding there. So the private sector is very important. And so we have a report out that we just launched. It's called Mobilizing Private Finance for Nature. And there's two key takeaways from that. One of them is that, yes, one needs to direct finance to green projects and to green investments, but perhaps it's even more important to look at greening finance and to provide incentives for investors to really look at the green, at the ecological, at the biodiversity side of what it is that they are financing. And I think a lot of the examples we saw today would fit into that. Let me conclude perhaps by giving a couple of ideas. So for instance, the replacement of hard gray black walls with ecological approaches, with sponge systems, for instance. This is something where if one were to bring in the private sector for finance, that where one needs to have it in the procurement specifications, and that does often not happen. So it is the many times it is, well, who will finance the cheapest retention wall, say? But it is not who will find the best solution and will do it in the most ecological way, while still economically and financially doing it in a viable way. And so if one changed that at large scale, I think one could go much more to scale on urban nature and urban biodiversity approaches. So these are a few thoughts on the presentations we have heard, but really very interesting. And thank you very much for all the excellent presentations.
Thank you very much, Karen. And last but not least, Professor Gretchen Daly.
Wonderful. I can't thank you enough for the opportunity to meet with you today and to experience the tremendous expertise, the tremendous vision, and the tremendous planning and commitment going into this aim of bringing nature into cities. What I thought I would touch on briefly, given the really comprehensive overview provided by the speakers before me, is just the role of the science. And science obviously is only one small part of this, a crucial part, but we need the leadership, the compelling demonstrations, the engagement with policymakers, planners, and investors to drive any of this science into action. So I'm just most inspired by all of the preceding speakers in laying out such a beautiful vision with such compelling demonstrations to build on, and the capacity now to replicate and scale up the work that's been done so far. I'll just touch on two dimensions in terms of the science. The first is to amplify a call made by all of the preceding speakers for an integrated and holistic approach. There have been tremendous advances in the science that enable us to look in a coherent way at the climate security dimensions, in urban cooling, in protection from storms and flooding, those sorts of things, in water security, in quantifying not only the quality of supply, but also the quantity under seasonal change and climate change, in looking at the economic vitality of cities, where it's not only a matter of livability, but the investment, the desire to be there, to visit, to invest, to build a sustainable economic system in cities. Another key dimension here that I think I'll touch on more relates to health and the context we're living in now. With the pandemic, we all know with our enormous population globally, our connectivity, our immune compromised populations from lack of food security and other health security, that the world is vulnerable to pandemics. But this pandemic, is a direct consequence of how we interact with nature. And health, integrating health sciences and health dimensions more into this planning will be a crucial aspect as well. And I'll just mention new work that has been done in the mental health arena that relates so closely to well-being and to productivity in cities, in urban development. So globally, there's a dramatic trend in increasing health disorders, especially in mental health in cities, about a 20% increase in anxiety disorders and a 40% increase in mood and depression related disorders among people living in cities as compared to people living in more rural or more natural settings. And this trend is alongside the trends of people becoming ever more disconnected from nature, having less and less access to nature, and also having much less time to get into nature, living on screens, children and adults alike, living more and more indoors. And so all of the examples given, Professor Yu, across the cities in China are just beautiful to see in terms of, and in Singapore by Dr. Chen, are just exhilarating to see in opening greater access to nature for both mental and physical health. And the science in these areas is advancing very quickly. So there's a lot of evidence now showing that greater experience of nature improves not only the emotional dimensions of mental health, but also cognitive functioning in schools, in the workplace, and productivity. So this evidence is similarly being developed in the physical activity arena, and many of the examples given by Professor Yu and Dr. Chan and Zhumin Wang also reinforce the idea of engaging people outside in nature for physical activity and health. And obviously the physical and mental dimensions of health are connected. So that's my main point, is that all of this science is now being integrated into a more holistic approach that allows planners to answer questions such as where to invest in nature to achieve the greatest return in terms of the multiple benefits in climate and water security, in vitality of cities, economically and in terms of livability and health, and in enabling us to track equity in cities and help understand who's most vulnerable in cities in terms of lack of security and in terms of ability to improve equity and reduce the vulnerability of those most exposed to the different risks resulting from the lack of nature in cities. And finally, I'll mention that this science is being integrated ever more and made accessible and actionable through tools that I know everyone here is deploying to guide investments in cities and guide combined engineering and nature-based approaches. So with the new data streams coming in, and China is really leading the world in this dimension as well, bringing data at the meter scale in cities to show where people are, enable citizen engagement and the stewardship that Dr. Chan mentioned, where citizens can observe nature and track what is around them and interact with apps that bring the nature to life more and the understanding of the benefits of nature experience through these types of apps and through just tracking at the meter scale what the benefits are to people in different places in the city, in different times, different levels of heat or cold, and so on, to inform where we make investments to maximize the use of space in cities to deliver livability, economic vitality, health, and all of the other objectives, especially the long-term stewardship and identification with biodiversity and attachment to it for the sustainable, livable cities vision that this global platform is bringing. So thank you very much for the opportunity to participate, and looking very much forward to working together to advance this science and the suite of tools further to replicate and scale the beautiful demonstrations that have been laid out. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Professor Daly, and for your comments, and earlier Karen, and of course following on those fantastic presentations. I mean, I wish the time had allowed us to have much more of a conversation. There were several questions being posed, but I think we're out of time. So maybe just by virtue of a quick wrap up, I think it's clear that the presentations today have demonstrated that issues of urban biodiversity, ecosystem services, economic prosperity, and the well-being of city dwellers are all interconnected, and it's essential to prevent biodiversity loss and preserve the integrity of those interconnected systems by integrating biodiversity ecosystems into urban planning and investing in green infrastructure. So I take out of this, the points made on the importance of preserving ecosystems and biodiversity, and how that requires a shift from the conventional planning approach to an integrated ecological approach to both planning but also to investment. And this notion of combining the amenity value with an enhanced resilience, sustainability, but also economic prosperity works as a whole. I also take note that the point on enhancing green connectivity ought to be one of the key objectives in ecological and spatial planning. And the presentation on Singapore's transition to a city in nature, demonstrates how we can work to restore nature in the urban landscape to mitigate those effects of a built environment that has been focused on the grey infrastructure, and by establishing this interconnectivity on green and blue assets. And lastly, as Shuman has presented, we stand ready as the World Bank to support cities to make this paradigm shift into both planning and investment. And it's not just to bring nature into cities, but to think of a citywide approach, and beyond, like Karen mentioned, of thinking about, you know, the corridors where cities will be integrated. So not a city within nature, but rather an inversion of that concept and to take it one level further. So, and all that would be part of our aim to help cities achieve that win-win solution of being, on the one hand, being able to protect the environment and biodiversity, but on the other hand, enhancing cities' overall resilience, livability, and competitiveness. So with that, thank you all very much for joining us. It was a very inspiring session. Thank you, Professor Yu. Thank you, Dr. Chan. Thank you, Professor Daly. Thank you, Karen. Thank you, Schumann. And thanks to Jürgen. And thanks to all for participating. Okay. Stay tuned then for the next GPSC online series. Bye.
Thank you very much. Good night. Bye.
Bye-bye.